My faithful Catholic mother's fears came true when, as a young atheist just out of high school, I was accepted into Bryn Mawr, a women's college right outside of Philadelphia. Little did my mother know that my intellectual work at Bryn Mawr would be one major factor in leading me eventually to revert to Catholicism. My favorite building on the Bryn Mawr campus, the Great Library Hall, is lined with these oil paintings of former presidents of the college. When I first noticed these paintings, it took a while to realize that what was striking about them was that the faces of so many women peered out. We just wanted to hop in quick to tell you about our new audio documentary.
Have you ever trusted someone deeply only to discover that they weren't who you thought they were?
That's what happened to us.
In Descent into Light, we share our story of spiritual abuse and how we walked through shock, grief, and betrayal toward a hope I didn't think was possible.
It's raw, it's real, and it's for anyone who's ever wrestled with faith and doubt.
Search Descent into Light wherever you get your podcasts or visit sistersofthelittleWay.com.
My 4 years at Bryn Mawr gave me many gifts, but one of the greatest was a historical perspective of the role of women in society. It helped me to understand that my college education as a woman was something to be cherished, not taken for granted. The time I spent at Bryn Mawr was not only foundational in how I view the potential of my contribution to society, but also in how I viewed myself as a woman. As someone raised in a devoutly Catholic home, I can honestly say that sadly, the positive potential of my feminine contribution to society was not something that was emphasized to me in the context of the church. Colored both by evangelical Christian messaging and the charismatic renewal that my family was involved in, my understanding of gender taught me, if not explicitly, but implicitly, that I was a misfit, that the intellectual and personality qualities that I possess as a woman were qualities better suited for a man, and therefore in need of modification within me, rather than empowerment. Unfortunately, since my reversion almost 20 years ago, I've seen this messaging to women grow steadily in mainstream Catholic culture, at least in the US. At the closing of Vatican II, Pope Paul VI acknowledged that though women's power to contribute to society has been limited, he argued that, quote, "The hour is coming, in fact has come, when the vocation of woman is being achieved in its fullness, the hour in which woman acquires in the world an influence, an effect, and a power never hitherto achieved." The theologian Romano Guardini defined power as, quote, "real energies capable of changing the reality of things, along with the will to establish specific goals and to launch and direct energies toward those goals," end quote. Of course, women have always had the capacity and often the will to change the reality of history, but women's capacity to change reality has been limited and historically overlooked. Edith Stein puts this dynamic bluntly when she wrote, quote, "The relationship of the sexes since the fall has become a brutal relationship of master and slave. Consequently, women's natural gifts and their best possible development are no longer considered. Rather, man uses her as a means to achieve his own ends in the exercise of his work or in pacifying his own lust," end quote. The Church is no exception to this reality. In his letter to women, John Paul II identifies what he calls a, quote, "conditioning of history that, quote, has been an obstacle to the progress of women," end quote. This conditioning, he argues, has often relegated women to the margins of society and even reduced them to servitude. He apologizes on behalf of the Church in cases where the blame for this maltreatment of women has, quote, "belonged to not just a few members of the Church." Despite this conditioning, John Paul II argues that, quote, "the Church's 2,000-year history has truly experienced the genius of women, who have left an impressive and beneficial mark in history." Here, John Paul II focuses on the positive impact of women's contributions to the Church, while also acknowledging that women's contributions have been historically marginalized. I believe the connection that John Paul II makes here demonstrates something I believe to be important, that the feminine genius, what he calls the feminine genius, cannot be detached from its expression from embodied women in a historical context and within a church in which their genius has been marginalized for centuries. Benedict XVI's papacy continued to emphasize the importance of the feminine genius, but I'm going to focus on a document he wrote before becoming pope as prefect of the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith. In a letter to bishops written by then Cardinal Ratzinger on behalf of John Paul II, Ratzinger argues that, quote, the witness of women's lives reveal those values without which humanity would be closed in self-sufficiency, dreams of power, and the drama of violence, end quote. Interestingly, in Ratzinger's thought, self-sufficiency is connected with what he calls self-made or false reform in the church. In a lecture given to the Communion and Liberation movement, Ratzinger wrote, quote, a self-made church is reduced to the empirical domain, and thus precisely as a dream comes to nothing. On the other hand, authentic renewal for Ratzinger entails removing what is not truly part of the church in the first place. Thus, for Ratzinger, feminine values work against elements of false reform in the church. In other words, I would argue that Ratzinger believes that the feminine genius is essential to genuine church reform. According to Ratzinger, reform is, quote, the essential basis of church order that constantly needs to be developed and applied concretely so that the church's life can unfold in a particular period. If we accept that continual reform is needed in every moment of the church, then this particular moment in church history clearly provides evidence of this need for reform and renewal. Marked by an abuse crisis that began to unfold more than 40 years ago, nothing else makes clearer the need for reform than the abuse of children and adults by clergy and other church ministers, and its subsequent systematic cover-up by bishops. If Ratzinger correctly identifies feminine values as necessary to reform, then now, more than ever, we need women's participation in the church. Perhaps providentially, just as this crisis erupted in the church, societal changes have paved the way for expanding the potential areas of women's participation in the church. Continuing in the thought of Benedict XVI, Pope Francis has made concrete steps to increase the influence of women and feminine values in the church. Interestingly, Francis explicitly connected the need for feminine values and systemic reform, saying, quote, women, by acquiring power in society, can change the system. If they succeed, so to speak, in converting power from the logic of domination to that of service and that of care. Francis's point here brings up a key aspect of necessary reform when it comes to abuse in the church, which is systemic reform. Demonstrating a particular talent for implementing creative and concrete changes that increase feminine influence in the church, including in key systemic areas, Francis appointed women in roles never before held by women in the Vatican. One example was the appointment of Sister Simona Brambilla, the first female prefect of the dicastery for the Institutes of Consecrated Life and Societies of Apostolic Life, which was a role previously reserved for cardinals and archbishops. He supported these changes by arguing, quote, the feminine genius is needed wherever we make important decisions. And as we enter the papacy of Pope Leo XIV, we'll see how he approaches this issue too. So all of this to say, I just want to be clear that I'm not arguing that the increased presence and influence of women in the church will necessarily prevent abuse. As the abuse crisis unfolded, you may have heard people say, well, if women were in charge, this never would have happened. But that's a form of gender essentialism, which in my view is one of the biggest pitfalls of the popularization of John Paul II's feminine genius. In other words, to argue that men cannot act in nurturing, protective ways that respect the dignity of the human person without women in the room, that's simply false. As Ratzinger argued in the same letter to bishops that I quoted earlier, feminine values are, quote, more than simply an attribute of the female sex, but rather they designate the fundamental human capacity to live for the other and because of the other. Thus, in speaking of men's and women's roles in society and the church, I really think it's crucial to avoid an essentialism that suggests that men cannot live certain values without women and vice versa. However, if our embodied experience as women is important, and I believe it is, it seems clear that women can help men to live certain values through our embodied femininity and vice versa. Finally, I would add that though it's important to avoid gender essentialism, it's also important not to lose sight of the reality that John Paul II spoke of the feminine genius rather than a masculine genius for an important reason. For most of human history, women have not experienced equal opportunity to participate in the life of society and the church. And it's important, if not crucial, to not lose sight of the historical perspective of this topic. As Vatican II acknowledges, we have reached, or rather I would say we're reaching toward, quote, the hour in which woman acquires in the world an influence, an effect, and a power never hitherto achieved. If as women we succeed in taking up the challenge of this moment to contribute our lives and thus our feminine values to the life of the church, we will play a crucial role in the process necessary in every age, that of reforming our church for the next generation.
Thanks for watching. Before you go, we'd love to tell you about our new audio documentary.
We've all felt the shock of learning about darkness in places that we thought were safe.
We felt that shock too. Last year, we shared our own stories of spiritual abuse publicly.
Now we're going deeper in Descent into Light, an 8-part audio documentary to explore how adult abuse happens in spiritual settings and how to prevent it.
Listening to this series is for the courageous. It's about hope, but not the easy kind. This is about a hope forged in darkness.
Join us. Together we can face the darkness because God lights the way.
Listen to Descent into Light at sistersofthelittlepway.com or wherever you get your podcasts.